He was supposed to shoot trespassers on sight. That was the rule. But when a bleeding teenager slammed into his chest, gasping, "Please hide me," the veteran guard didn't raise his rifle. He opened his coat. What happened next tore the monarchy apart. The brass buttons on Thomas's ceremonial coat felt like ice pressed directly against his sternum. It was 3:14 a.m. on a Tuesday, and the London fog had congealed into a fine, stinging drizzle that tasted faintly of exhaust fumes and wet asphalt. He hated the rain. It seeped into the stiff red wool of his tunic, making it smell like a wet dog, and pooled in the uncomfortable creases of his boots. His left knee, ruined by a localized mortar blast in a desert a lifetime ago, throbbed in time with his heartbeat. Standing perfectly still was an art form, but it was mostly just an exercise in ignoring misery. For 12 years, Thomas had stood outside the wrought iron perimeter of the palace. He was a piece of architecture. Tourists took photos with him, making faces, waving hands, occasionally trying to provoke a reaction. He never gave them one. He was 52 years old, underpaid, perpetually tired, and completely disillusioned with the crown he was sworn to protect. The royals were just people who lived in a very large house, obsessed with optics, completely insulated from the reality of the damp, shivering city beyond their gates. The North Gate was usually quiet. It lacked the grandeur of the main plaza, facing a narrow, tree-lined avenue, slick with dead leaves. Thomas's gloved hands gripped his SA-80 rifle. The metal was freezing. He was mentally calculating how many hours he had left before he could clock out, strip off the damp wool, and drink a lukewarm beer in his cramped flat. Then came the sound. It wasn't a footstep. It was the sharp, metallic groan of the wrought iron fence, taking sudden weight, followed immediately by the tearing of fabric. Thomas didn't jump. Decades of training kept his posture rigid, but his eyes snapped toward the shadows. 10 yards to his left, something heavy dropped into the gravel bordering the rose bushes. Protocol dictated a clear sequence of events. Port arms issue a loud verbal challenge, press the silent alarm strapped to his belt, and if the intruder advanced, fire. Thomas shifted his weight, his thumb sliding over the safety of the rifle. The click was loud in the suffocating dampness of the night. A figure crawled out of the shrubbery. It wasn't a coordinated assault. It wasn't an armed terrorist. It was a mess of limbs moving with frantic, uncoordinated desperation. The intruder stumbled onto the paved walkway, directly into the weak pool of amber light spilling from the street lamp. It was a kid, a teenager, maybe 16, wearing a kitchen porter's uniform that was torn at the shoulder. He was missing a shoe. The boy didn't run away from the guard. He ran directly toward him, staggering his breath, hitching in ragged, wet gasps. "Halt!" Thomas barked. His voice was a rusty saw, rough from hours of disuse. "Stay exactly where you are." The boy didn't stop. He crashed directly into Thomas, nearly knocking the older man off balance. The impact was startlingly light. The kid was skin and bones beneath the soaked cotton uniform. Thomas shoved him back, raising the barrel of the rifle to the boy's chest. Up close, the sensory details hit Thomas like a physical blow. The kid smelled of industrial bleach, stale sweat, and the sharp, hot copper tang of fresh blood. A dark stain was spreading across the collar of his white shirt. His eyes were blown wide, the whites visible all the way around the irises, terrified and feral. "Please," the boy choked out. His voice broke high and raw. "Please, they're going to kill me. Please hide me." Back away from the weapon. Thomas ordered his tone, flat, bureaucratic. His thumb hovered over the panic button on his belt. Press it, and within 40 seconds, the palace response unit would swarm the gate. The kid would be tackled, zip-tied, dragged into the subterranean processing rooms. It was the easy choice. It was the only choice. "You don't understand," the boy whispered, his dirty fingers reaching out, trembling violently to barely graze the sleeve of Thomas's thick coat. "I saw him. I saw what he did in the conservatory. He saw me." Thomas frowned. The conservatory. That was deep inside the private residential wing. A kitchen porter had no business being anywhere near there. Before Thomas could press the button, the heavy oak doors of the palace's north entrance slammed open. 60 yards away, the sharp, rapid thud of tactical boots echoed across the courtyard. Flashlight beams sliced through the fog, frantic and sweeping. "Check the perimeter," a voice barked. Thomas recognized the voice. Commander Weston, head of internal security. Weston didn't come out in the rain for a misplaced tourist or a drunk who scaled the fence on a dare. Weston was a fixer, a cleaner, the kind of man who made problems disappear without leaving paperwork. The boy let out a small, pathetic whimper, his legs giving out. He sank to his knees on the wet pavement, wrapping his arms around himself. He didn't try to run. He just looked up at Thomas, entirely defeated. Thomas looked at the boy. Then he looked at the approaching flashlights. In a fraction of a second, Thomas's brain ran a devastating calculation. He thought about his pension. He thought about the rules. He thought about the quiet, empty remainder of his life. And then he felt an unexpected, violently intense surge of revulsion. Not toward the boy, but toward the uniform. He wore the cold brass buttons, the pristine gates, and the men running across the courtyard to erase a terrified teenager in a torn shirt. "Get up!" Thomas hissed, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. The boy blinked, paralyzed. Thomas grabbed the kid by the scruff of his neck, hauling him to his feet with brute force. Behind Thomas's assigned position was a narrow sentry box, mostly for show, but built into its rear panel was a shallow maintenance alcove housing the gate's hydraulic controls. It was barely wide enough for a grown man's shoulders. Thomas shoved the boy backward. The kid stumbled, hitting the metal grating of the alcove. "Not a sound. You don't breathe. You don't swallow," Thomas ordered, slamming the heavy wooden door of the sentry box shut, effectively trapping the boy in the pitch-black space between the box and the stone pillar. Thomas stepped back onto his mark. He squared his shoulders. He adjusted his grip on the SA-80. He slowed his breathing, forcing his heart rate to drop, schooling his features into the blank, dead-eyed stare of a professional monument. 10 seconds later, Commander Weston and 2 armed response officers broke through the fog, their weapons drawn, their flashlight beams blinding. "Reese!" Weston barked, coming to a halt 3 feet away. The commander was breathing hard, the rain instantly beading on the shoulders of his black tactical jacket. He smelled of expensive cologne and ozone. His eyes, pale and sharp, darted around the courtyard before locking onto Thomas. "Sir," Thomas replied. His voice was perfectly level, monotone, boring. "Did you see anyone come through here?" Weston demanded, stepping closer. The beam of his flashlight swept the wet pavement, catching the glint of the wrought iron fence. "A boy, staff uniform. He breached the residential wing about 4 minutes ago." "Negative, sir," Thomas said, staring straight ahead at a point just above Weston's left shoulder. "I've been on post. No movement on the perimeter." Weston narrowed his eyes. He stepped right into Thomas's personal space. Thomas could see the subtle twitch in the commander's jaw. Weston wasn't just doing a sweep, he was panicked. Beneath the aggressive posture, there was a frantic urgency that Thomas had never seen in the man before. "You're telling me a bleeding kid didn't just vault that gate right in front of your face?" Weston's voice dropped, laced with a dangerous edge. He leaned in, and the beam of his flashlight passed over the gravel, then up to the sentry box. Thomas felt a drop of cold sweat slide down his spine, tracing the vertebrae. His mind raced, calculating the odds. Had the kid left blood on the pavement? Had he dropped something? I have observed 0 unauthorized movement. Commander Om. Thomas repeated his tone, infused with just enough mild elderly annoyance to sound authentic. Just the rain, sir. If someone went over the fence, they did it out of my sightline. Weston stared at him for a long, agonizing moment. The silence stretched, filled only by the hiss of the rain and the distant hum of city traffic. Thomas forced himself not to blink. He knew Weston was looking for a tell, a shift in weight, a swallowed breath, a flicker of the eyes. Thomas gave him nothing. He channeled 12 years of mind-numbing boredom into his expression. Finally, Weston cursed under his breath. He tapped his earpiece. Gate 4 is clear. He might have headed toward the East Gardens, widen the net. He looked back at Thomas, his expression sour. Keep your eyes open, old man. If you see him, you don't call it in. You shoot him. Understood. Understood, sir, Thomas said. Weston turned and jogged back towards the palace, his men following close behind. The shadows swallowed them. Thomas didn't move for 5 full minutes. He waited until the sound of their boots faded completely into the ambient noise of the city. He waited until his own heart stopped hammering against his ribs. Only then did he lower his rifle. He stepped backward, reaching behind the sentry box. He fumbled with the latch of the maintenance alcove. The wood was swollen from the damp. He yanked it hard. The door popped open. The boy tumbled out, collapsing onto the wet pavement like a sack of loose bones. He was gasping, his hands clawing at his throat as if he'd been holding his breath the entire time. Get up, Thomas said, harshly. There was no warmth in his voice. The adrenaline was fading, replaced by a cold, heavy dread. He had just lied to the head of internal security. He had harbored a fugitive on royal grounds. It was treason. It was immediate termination, prison, maybe worse. Get up, you can't stay here. The boy scrambled to his feet, leaning heavily against the stone pillar. In the dim light, Thomas got a better look at him. He was younger than he first thought. His face was smeared with dirt and grease, but his eyes were sharp. The blood on his collar was fresh, seeping from a laceration on his neck. Thank you, the boy whispered, his teeth chattering uncontrollably. I thought he was going to— Shut up, Thomas snapped. He grabbed the kid by the arm, dragging him out of the light. The boy's arm was shockingly thin. Do you have any idea what you've just done to me? What I've just done? I didn't have anywhere else to go. The boy pleaded, his voice breaking. The cameras, they shut them off in the residential wing. That's how I knew it was bad. When I walked into the conservatory, I don't want to hear it. Thomas interrupted his voice, a harsh hiss. He pressed 2 fingers to the bridge of his nose, trying to ward off the headache that was rapidly forming behind his eyes. Whatever you saw, whatever you did, I don't care. Ignorance is my only defense right now. He killed her, the boy blurted out. The words hung in the damp air. Thomas froze. He looked at the kid, the crown prince. The boy said the words, tumbling out of him in a desperate, frantic rush. I was bringing up the ice buckets. I took the wrong service elevator. The conservatory was dark. I heard a noise. I saw him. He had his hands around Lady Harrington's throat. He was slamming her head against the marble floor. Over and over. There was so much blood. He looked up. He saw me. Thomas felt his stomach drop. Lady Harrington, the young charismatic aide to the Queen. The press loved her. The entire country loved her. You're lying, Thomas said, though the hollow feeling in his gut told him otherwise. Why would I lie? The boy cried softly, pointing a trembling finger at his own bloody collar. One of Weston's men clipped me with a baton in the kitchen corridor before I made it out a window. They're going to kill me, and they're going to say I did it. They're going to frame a nobody kitchen porter for murdering a duchess. Thomas stared at the boy. The cynical protective shell he had spent 12 years building was cracking. He wanted to drag the kid to the guardhouse, hand him over, and go back to sleep. He wanted to pretend he hadn't heard a word. But he looked at the boy's terrified eyes, the pathetic way he shivered in the cold, and Thomas knew he couldn't do it. "What's your name?" Thomas asked, his voice suddenly very tired. "Leo." "All right, Leo," Thomas said, looking around the dark, empty street. His shift ended in 20 minutes. The relief guard would be walking up the path soon. "We have a massive problem, and if we don't get off this street in the next 10 minutes, we're both going to disappear." Thomas slung his heavy rifle over his shoulder and grabbed a thick set of iron keys from his belt. "Follow me. Stay in my shadow. If you fall behind, I leave you." Leo nodded frantically. Thomas turned away from the gate, walking toward the narrow service alley that ran parallel to the outer wall. He was throwing away his career, his pension, his entire quiet life for a stranger. It was the stupidest thing he had ever done. But as the rain hit his face, washing away the smell of brass polish, Thomas realized for the first time in a decade he actually felt awake. The service alley smelled of rotting cabbage and wet brick. Thomas walked with a stiff, unnatural gait, the pain in his ruined knee radiating up his thigh like a hot wire. His heavy ceremonial coat, usually a symbol of immovable authority, now just felt like a soggy sponge dragging him down. Leo was a ghost, trailing a few paces behind. The boy kept tripping over his own feet, his breath catching in ragged, uneven hitches. He was going into shock. Thomas didn't need to be a medic to see it. The kid's skin was the color of skim milk under the sickly yellow glare of the streetlights, and he was shivering so violently his teeth clicked. "Keep up," Thomas grunted, not looking back. They avoided the main thoroughfares. London at 4 a.m. was a desolate, hostile place. The fog had thickened, turning the amber street lamps into hazy, floating orbs. Every passing set of headlights made Thomas's stomach tighten. He knew the protocol for a palace lockdown. By now, Weston's men would be coordinating with the Metropolitan Police, setting up quiet cordons tapping into the city's massive CCTV network. They wouldn't broadcast a manhunt immediately. They'd want to keep it contained, sanitize the scene, control the narrative, which meant Thomas and the boy had a very narrow window before the invisible net pulled tight. It took them 40 agonizing minutes to reach Thomas's flat in Kennington. It was a bleak, brutalist concrete block that looked like a leftover bunker from the Cold War. The elevator had been broken since October. They took the stairs, 4 flights. With every step, Thomas's knee ground in a sickening bone-on-bone rhythm. By the time he jammed his key into the flimsy lock of door 42B, he was sweating through his wool tunic. He shoved Leo inside and slammed the door, throwing the deadbolt and locking the chain. The flat was cold. It smelled of stale tea leaves, damp laundry and old dust. It was the apartment of a man who only used it to sleep and occasionally stare at the wall. There were no photographs, no plants, just a worn-out sofa, a small television, and a kitchenette with a dripping faucet. "Sit," Thomas ordered, pointing to a rigid kitchen chair. Leo collapsed into it. He looked around the dismal room, his eyes glazed. He brought a trembling hand up to his neck. The bleeding had slowed, but the white collar of his uniform was saturated, the blood drying into a stiff, rusty crust. Thomas stripped off his red tunic. He tossed it onto the sofa, feeling a strange wave of disgust as it landed. Underneath his white undershirt clung to his ribs. He walked into the cramped bathroom and opened the mirrored cabinet. He bypassed the aspirin and grabbed a bottle of cheap rubbing alcohol, a roll of gauze, and a pair of blunt scissors. When he returned to the kitchen, Leo had his head in his hands, weeping silently. His thin shoulders shook. "Stop that," Thomas said. His voice wasn't unkind, but it was completely devoid of sympathy. "Crying dehydrates you, and we don't have time for it." He uncapped the alcohol. "Tilt your head back." Leo obeyed, wincing as Thomas peeled the stiff, bloody collar away from the skin. The cut wasn't incredibly deep, but it was jagged, angry, and high up on the collarbone. It looked like the result of a glancing blow from a heavy, blunt object. A telescopic baton, just like the kid had said. "This is going to burn," Thomas warned. He didn't wait for a response. He poured the alcohol directly onto the folded gauze and pressed it hard against the wound. Leo let out a strangled, muffled shriek, his body arching rigid against the back of the chair. His hands gripped the plastic seat so hard, his knuckles turned stark white. "Breathe through your nose." Thomas instructed his face inches from the boy's. The smell of copper and terrified sweat was overwhelming. "Focus on the pain. Let it keep you awake. If you pass out now, I'm dragging you to the curb." It was a lie, but it worked. The boy forced his eyes open, gasping shallowly, anchoring himself to the sharp sting of the antiseptic. Thomas worked quickly, taping a thick square of gauze over the laceration. When he was done, he stepped back, wiping his hands on a dirty dish towel. He walked over to the small, grimy window overlooking the street and cracked the blinds. The street was empty, just parked cars and wet asphalt, but Thomas knew the peace was an illusion. "Why did you hide me?" Leo asked suddenly. His voice was raspy, barely above a whisper. Thomas let the blind snap shut. He walked over to the kitchenette and turned on the tap, filling a chipped mug with tap water. He drank it in one long gulp. He didn't have a good answer. He should have pressed the button. He should have handed the kid over. But he had looked at Weston, a man who wore tailored suits and ordered assassinations like he was ordering lunch. And then he had looked at the terrified kid in the cheap shoes. "I don't like Weston," Thomas finally said. It was a gross understatement, but it was the only truth he could articulate. "They're going to kill me," Leo whispered, staring at his blood-stained hands. "He's the crown prince. He's going to be king. You don't just walk in on the future king murdering someone and live to talk about it." "No," Thomas agreed flatly. "You don't." He pulled out one of the other kitchen chairs and sat down heavily, his bad leg stretched out straight. The reality of the situation was settling over him like wet concrete. He was an accessory after the fact to the highest level of treason conceivable. Weston wasn't a fool. When the security sweeps turned up nothing in the gardens, he would start looking closer. He would pull the perimeter, CCTV. He would see the blind spots. He would remember the old guard who looked a little too calm. "Do you have family?" Thomas asked. "Anyone who is going to file a missing persons report." "Just my mum," Leo said, swallowing hard. "She works nights at a care home in Croydon. I told her I was working a double shift." "Good, let her think that." Thomas rubbed his face. The stubble on his jaw felt like sandpaper. "We need to sleep. 2 hours. Then we have to move. Because by sunrise, this city is going to tear itself apart looking for you." Dawn didn't break over London. It just sort of leaked through the grey clouds, turning the sky the colour of dirty dishwater. The heavy square television in Thomas's living room flickered to life. Thomas had the volume turned down so low it was barely a murmur, but the scrolling red banner at the bottom of the screen screamed the news in absolute, undeniable silence. Breaking tragedy at the palace. Lady Harrington found dead. Met police launch. Nationwide manhunt for rogue staff member. Thomas stood in the centre of the room, a mug of instant coffee growing cold in his hand. The screen showed a glamorous, smiling photo of Lady Harrington in a tailored blue dress standing beside the Queen at a charity gala. Then the image cut to a grainy, low-resolution ID badge photo. It was Leo. He looked even younger in the photo, his hair awkwardly brushed, smiling a nervous, crooked smile. "Oh, God!" A voice choked out from the doorway. Thomas turned. Leo was standing there wearing a pair of Thomas's old sweatpants that swallowed him whole and a faded grey t-shirt. He was staring at the television, his face completely bloodless. "They used my ID photo," Leo whispered. He rushed to the kitchen sink and violently dry-heaved. Nothing came up. His stomach was completely empty. He just stood there, gripping the cheap metal edges of the sink, shaking. Thomas didn't offer comfort. He walked over to the small particle-board wardrobe in the corner of the room. He pulled out a battered olive-drab duffel bag. It hadn't been used since his deployment, but it still smelled faintly of canvas and gun oil. "Of course they used your photo," Thomas said, tossing a pair of heavy boots and a stack of civilian clothes into the bag. Weston works fast. He's already planted the narrative. A disgruntled, unstable kitchen porter attacks a beloved royal aide in the dead of night. It's clean. It's simple. The public will eat it up because it's easier to digest than the truth. "I didn't do it," Leo yelled, spinning around, his voice cracking with hysteria. "I was just delivering ice. He hit her with a marble bust. I saw him drop it." "Keep your voice down." Thomas snapped his tone sharp enough to cut bone. "I know you didn't do it, but it doesn't matter what I know. That television right there. That's reality now. You are the most wanted person in the United Kingdom, and by extension, so am I." Thomas walked into the bathroom. He opened the cabinet again, ignoring the medical supplies this time. He grabbed a pair of electric clippers he used for his own military buzz cut. He walked back out and plugged them into the wall socket near the kitchen. They hummed to life with a loud, aggressive buzz. "Sit," Thomas ordered, pointing to the chair. Leo backed away, his eyes wide. "What are you doing? You have curly brown hair. It's distinct. It's on every news channel in the country. Sit down." Leo hesitated, staring at the clippers like they were a weapon. But the sheer immovable authority in Thomas's posture broke his resistance. He slumped into the chair, his shoulders defeated. Thomas didn't use a guard. He pressed the bare metal blades right against the kid's scalp. He worked systematically, starting from the nape of the neck and pushing upward. The dark curls fell in soft, silent clumps onto the cheap linoleum floor. It was a brutal, intimate act. The boy's neck was incredibly fragile, the skin pale and tight. The stark white gauze pad taped to his collarbone was a glaring reminder of how close he had come to dying on that marble floor. Thomas felt a strange, uncomfortable tightening in his chest. He had spent his entire adult life taking orders, guarding doors, standing still while the world moved around him. He had never been a protector. He had been a prop. "My mum loved my hair," Leo mumbled quietly, a tear finally spilling over and cutting a clean line through the dirt on his cheek. "Hair grows back," Thomas said gruffly. "Dead kids don't." He finished the job, wiping the excess hair off the boy's shoulders with a towel. Leo looked entirely different, harsher, older. The shaved head highlighted the sharp, underfed angles of his jaw and the hollows of his cheeks. Thomas tossed him a dark navy beanie. "Put that on. Pull it low." Thomas went to his bedroom. He reached under his mattress and pulled out an old metal lockbox. Inside was an envelope containing £2,000 in cash, his emergency fund built over a decade of miserable shifts. Beside it lay a heavy matte black Glock 19. It was completely illegal for him to possess it off-duty. He had bought it off a returning contractor 3 years ago, a paranoid impulse he had never truly justified to himself until today. He checked the magazine, fully loaded. He slid it into the waistband of his jeans at the small of his back, pulling a heavy rain jacket over it to conceal the bulge. He grabbed his keys and the duffel bag. "Let's go," Thomas said, walking toward the door. "Where are we going?" Leo asked, scrambling to keep up, pulling the beanie down over his ears. "We can't go to the police. The police take their orders from the same people who are trying to kill you," Thomas said, opening the door and checking the hallway. It was empty. The air smelled of burnt toast from a neighboring flat. "We're going to find someone who doesn't exist on paper." They hurried down the 4 flights of concrete stairs. Thomas ignored the screaming pain in his knee. The adrenaline was back sharp and metallic in his mouth. They pushed through the heavy lobby doors and stepped out into the morning air. The rain had stopped, but the sky was a bruised, heavy grey. Thomas turned right, heading toward the narrow alley that connected to the back streets. As they stepped off the curb, a sleek, unmarked black SUV turned the corner at the end of the block. It wasn't a police cruiser. It had tinted windows and heavy reinforced suspension. It was moving slowly, creeping along the parked cars like a predator smelling blood. Thomas grabbed Leo by the back of his jacket and violently shoved him into the recessed doorway of a closed off-license shop. "Don't move," Thomas breathed, flattening his own back against the brick wall, his hand drifting instinctively toward the cold metal at the small of his back. The SUV rolled past. The engine was a deep, quiet purr. Thomas watched the reflection of the vehicle in the wet windows of the shop across the street. It didn't stop, but it didn't speed up either. It was hunting. Weston was already here. The brake lights of the SUV flared crimson against the wet asphalt, casting a bloody glow over the puddles. Thomas held his breath. His knuckles pressed white-hot against the brickwork of the recessed doorway. The exhaust pipe hissed, spitting a cloud of grey vapour into the damp morning air. For 10 agonizing seconds, the vehicle idled. The engine rumbled a deep, rhythmic vibration Thomas could feel in his teeth. Then the tyres crunched over wet gravel, and the SUV rolled forward, turning at the far intersection and disappearing behind a row of terraced houses. Thomas let out a slow, controlled exhale. He grabbed Leo's shoulder, pulling him away from the glass door of the off-license. "Through the alley, now!" They moved fast. The alleyway was a narrow trench of rotting brick and overflowing trash bins, reeking of sour milk and damp cardboard. Every step sent a jolt of fire up Thomas's ruined leg, but he forced himself into a rigid, punishing limp. He couldn't afford to slow down. Weston's men were sweeping the grid. It was only a matter of time before they checked his apartment building's security footage, or kicked in his door and found the freshly shorn hair on the linoleum. "Who are we going to?" Leo gasped, struggling to match Thomas's stride. His oversized boots slapped clumsily against the pavement. "An old acquaintance," Thomas muttered, his eyes scanning the rooftops and fire escapes. "Someone who hates the crown more than he likes money." They reached a chain-link fence at the end of the alley. The metal was rusted, sagging in the middle. Thomas pressed it down with his good boot, shoving Leo over, before awkwardly vaulting it himself. He landed hard. His left knee buckled entirely, sending him crashing into a pile of discarded wooden pallets. The pain was blinding, a sharp, white-hot spike that stole the air from his lungs. "Thomas!" Leo dropped to his knees, his hands hovering over the older man, unsure what to touch. "I'm fine." Thomas ground out, tasting dirt and old iron in the back of his throat. He hauled himself up, using the brick wall, his face pale and slick with cold sweat. He wasn't fine. He was 52, carrying a weapon he hadn't fired in years, dragging a teenage fugitive through the dirt. The absurdity of it all threatened to crush him. But then he looked at the stark terror in Leo's eyes, the way the oversized beanie sat crooked on his shaved head. Thomas spat onto the gravel. Walk! It took them 2 hours to reach Bermondsey. They avoided the main roads, sticking to the pedestrian underpasses and the derelict railway arches where the CCTV cameras were either smashed or rusted shut. The city was waking up. The distant rumble of commuter trains and the sharp screech of bus brakes echoed through the concrete corridors. Every siren made Leo flinch his shoulders, drawing up to his ears like a beaten dog. Their destination was a sprawling salvage yard tucked beneath a massive overpass. The air here was thick with the acrid scent of burnt oil welding ozone and rusting iron. A corrugated metal gate blocked the entrance, secured by a heavy padlock. Thomas didn't knock. He reached over the gate, feeling blindly for the hidden latch mechanism he knew was welded to the inner post. With a sharp, metallic clack, the gate swung inward. The yard was a maze of crushed cars and stacked shipping containers. At the center stood a gutted double-decker bus, its windows plated with sheet metal serving as a makeshift office. "Hold it right there, Tommy." The voice was like grinding stones. It came from the shadow of a stacked Ford Transit. A man stepped into the pale morning light. He was built like a cinder block, wearing grease-stained overalls and holding a sawed-off shotgun completely level with Thomas's chest. His face was a map of old scars, his nose broken one too many times. This was Barrett. He had served with Thomas in Basra back when they were both young enough to believe in the uniform. "Put the gun down, Barrett," Thomas said, his voice terrifyingly calm. He didn't raise his hands. Barrett's dark eyes flicked from Thomas to the boy trembling behind him. The mechanic let out a low, humorless whistle. "I saw the morning broadcast. You've lost your mind, mate. That kid's face is plastered on every screen from here to Edinburgh. The bounty is quiet, but it's massive. Internal security is offering $250,000 for his location." "He didn't do it," Thomas said. "I don't give a toss if he did or didn't." Barrett barked, the shotgun wavering slightly. "He's radioactive. You bring him into my yard, they'll flatten this whole block to get to him." "He saw the prince do it," Thomas stated, dropping the words like lead weights onto the oily dirt. "He saw the future king cave the woman's skull in. Weston is cleaning it up." Barrett froze. The cynical smirk vanished from his face, replaced by a deep, hollow unease. He stared at Leo, taking in the blood-crusted collar barely visible beneath the oversized jacket, the pale, hollow cheeks. Barrett knew Thomas. He knew Thomas was a man composed entirely of rules and protocol. For Thomas to break rank, the truth had to be undeniable. "You're a dead man, Tommy," Barrett whispered, lowering the barrel of the shotgun an inch. "Probably," Thomas agreed. "I need a vehicle, something with clean plates, and I need 2 untraceable phones. I'm tapping out my retirement fund, $2,000 cash." Barrett laughed, a dry, harsh sound. $2,000 won't cover a clean bumper in this city anymore." He shook his head, staring at the ground, a war raging behind his scarred face. He sighed, a sound of profound exhaustion. "Container 4, blue Volvo estate. Keys are in the visor. It's registered to a dead man in Leeds." Thomas nodded. He reached into his pocket and tossed the envelope of cash onto the dirt. "Thanks." As Thomas and Leo turned toward the shipping containers, a sharp synthetic buzzing pierced the quiet of the yard. Thomas stopped dead. The sound was coming from his own heavy rain jacket. It was his personal cell phone, a phone that only 3 people in the world had the number to: his landlord, his dentist, and the palace switchboard. He pulled the phone out. The screen glowed harshly in the gloom. It was an unknown number. Thomas stared at it. His thumb hovered over the red button, but a sick, twisting instinct told him to answer. He pressed the phone to his ear. "Speak." "You should have pressed the button, Thomas." Commander Weston's voice was perfectly clear, devoid of static dripping with aristocratic condescension. "You had a good career, a quiet life. Now you've forced me to make a mess." Thomas looked at Leo, then at the rusty gate they had just walked through. His blood ran freezing cold. "You don't know where I am?" "I don't need to," Weston replied smoothly. "You left your uniform in your flat, Thomas, but you took your boots. Did you forget the souls have passive RFID trackers for perimeter logs? We've been watching you limp across the city for 2 hours. We're at the gates, old man. Don't make me shoot through the kid to get to you." The line went dead. Thomas dropped the phone. He drew the Glock 19 from his waistband, the black metal heavy and final in his grip. He turned to Leo, his eyes completely hollowed out. "Get in the car," Thomas ordered. "Now, the walls are closing in, and Thomas has to make the ultimate choice: surrender or go to war against the Crown itself. If you want to see the explosive finale of this deadly standoff, make sure to hit that subscribe button. Give this video a like, share it with anyone who loves a good thriller, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss the final chapter. What would you do in Thomas's shoes? Drop your thoughts in the comments below.